The first time I called a closure that Soren Holt disagreed with, he stood in the doorway of Patrol Hut 9 for 4 seconds without saying anything, which I later learned was the closest he ever came to losing his composure. I'm Reid Callahan, avalanche forecaster for the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, and I'd been embedded at Arapahoe Basin for 11 days when the disagreement happened. My job is to read the snowpack, to understand what the mountain is holding and what it's about to release, and to make calls that are unpopular with the people who want to ski the terrain I've just closed. I'm used to the pushback, lift operators, resort management, ski instructors with clients who've driven 4 hours from Denver. Everyone has a reason why the closure is inconvenient, and none of those reasons change the load distribution on a weak layer buried 18 inches down. Soren was different. He wasn't pushback. He was a counter-argument. The solar aspect on that pitch has been running reactive for 3 days, he said, from the doorway, calm and precise. You're closing it based on the north-facing data. I'm closing it based on the north-facing data and the storm slab formation on the ridgeline above it, I said. The solar aspect reactivity is why the weak layer is primed. The storm slab is what delivers the load. 4 seconds of silence. What's your confidence interval? He said. Nobody had ever asked me that before. Not like that. Not as a genuine methodological question. Not with the expectation that I had one and could state it precisely. 73%, I said. The ridgeline observation is from yesterday at 1400. I want a fresh read before I'll move it. He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. I'll do the ridgeline observation, he said. Give me 40 minutes. He came back in 38. His data moved my confidence to 81%. The closure held. That was the beginning. Arapahoe Basin sits at 10,080 feet at the base and climbs to 13,050 at the summit, high enough that the weather systems that look dramatic from Denver are, up here, simply the conditions. The mountain does not perform its weather. It has it, the way it has its geology, matter-of-factly and without concern for inconvenience. I'd been forecasting avalanche terrain for 4 years, the last 2 based out of the CAIC office in Denver and deployed to resort sites during high-risk windows. I understood snowpack the way some people understood language, not just the vocabulary, but the grammar of it, the way layers communicated stress and history and intention. A persistent weak layer buried under 60 centimeters of new snow was not a passive thing. It was a sentence the mountain had been constructing for weeks, and my job was to read it before it finished speaking. Soren Holt had been on ski patrol at Arapahoe Basin for 6 years. Before that, wilderness EMT in the Tetons. Before that, he mentioned it once, briefly, the way people mention things they've processed enough to carry lightly. Search and rescue volunteer in Summit County, starting at age 19. He had the specific physical economy of someone who had been moving through mountain terrain for so long that efficiency wasn't a technique. It was just how his body worked. No wasted motion, no performative urgency. He was also, I came to understand, the person on this mountain who most needed to know what I knew. A ski patrol medic's work is the consequence of a forecaster's misses. Every time I got a closure wrong, closed too cautiously, missing rideable terrain, or worse, not cautiously enough. Soren was the one who went into the field. He was the one with the probe and the beacon and the airbag pack, moving across terrain that was actively hostile to find people the mountain had decided to keep. He understood my data the way a doctor understands the difference between a clean X-ray and a concerning one. He wasn't a passive recipient of my assessments. He was a second reader. That was the thing I hadn't expected. That was the thing that changed how the winter went. The second week of February brought a loading event, 48 hours of wind-driven snow at the ridgeline, northwest aspect, 23 centimeters of new snow over a rain crust that had formed and refrozen in January and been waiting under progressive snowpack ever since. I'd been tracking it for 10 days. I had a model running on the CAIC system and a field notebook with 3 pages of pit observations and a specific, unpleasant certainty about what the north-facing bowls above Patrol Hut 9 were going to do when the loading stopped and the temperature dropped. Overnight, I presented it to the patrol team at the Aero 600 briefing, standard protocol, forecaster update, recommendation for the day's terrain decisions. Soren was in the back of the room. He listened without writing anything down, which I'd noticed was how he listened when he was building the information into something rather than recording it. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. Each one was the question I would have asked if I'd been listening to my own briefing. After the meeting, he stopped me in the hallway outside the hut. "The rain crust," he said, "you're treating it as a sliding surface. It's the most continuous layer in the pit data. It's also got a melt freeze texture that's going to vary by aspect." He had his patrol pack on, ready for the day's first sweep. The east-facing sections of the North Bowl might not slide the same way. "I know," I said. "That's why the east-facing sections are on a separate closure protocol. I can open them on a case-by-case basis if the aspect data supports it." He looked at me. "You had that in the presentation. Slide 12, I said. "I know it's a lot of slides." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "I'll reread slide 12, he said, and walked out into the mountain morning, the cold hitting him with the indifference it hit everything up here, and he moved into it without adjusting. I stood in the hallway for a moment longer than I needed to. The thing about working at altitude with someone who is genuinely competent is that you stop being able to pretend the awareness is purely professional. It isn't surveillance. It isn't distraction. It's more like calibration. Like your instruments start reading more accurately when they're near the right reference point. I went back to my data. The avalanche on February 19th happened at 11:47 a.m. I'd been running probability updates since Aero 900, watching the temperature drop exactly as the model predicted and feeling the specific, grim satisfaction of being right about something you'd have preferred to be wrong about. The north-facing bowls were closed. The east-facing sections were on restricted access with patrol escort only. The ridgeline above Patrol Hut 9 was closed to everyone. The skier who triggered the slide had ducked a closure rope. This happens. It happens despite the signage and the rope lines and the briefings and every reasonable measure, because mountains are large and people make decisions that the data doesn't account for. He was 24 years old, an experienced backcountry skier who had made a risk assessment that didn't include the rain crust layer because he hadn't been in my briefing and hadn't seen my pit data and didn't know what the mountain had been building for 6 weeks. The slab that released was 180 meters wide and ran 340 meters vertical. I was at the CAC's instrument station on the East Ridge when the seismic sensor triggered. I heard it a half-second later, the specific crack and whomp of a slab releasing, a sound that carries differently than anything else in mountain terrain, a sound that ends conversations. My radio was already up. Patrol Hut 9, this is Callahan, seismic trigger North Bowl, grid reference 779er, confirm visual. Soren's voice came back immediately. He'd heard it too. Confirmed visual, North Bowl primary, debris field running toward the lower traverse. I have a beacon signal. A pause. Half a second. The time it took him to read the beacon receiver. A single burial. Depth unknown. I'm moving. Soren. The ridgeline above the debris field was still loaded. My model said 67% residual release probability on the secondary slab. The secondary is still live. I know, he said. What's my window? This is the question that lives between the data and the person. My model said the secondary slab was most likely to release in the next 90 minutes as the temperature continued to drop and the load redistributed. It also said the window before that was workable, tight, conditional, dependent on Soren moving fast and reading the terrain correctly. Soren moved fast and read terrain correctly. That was the most documented fact I had about him. 60 minutes maximum, I said. Move on the eastern margin. The crust is more consolidated there. Stay off the crown face. Copy. Talk to me on channel 4. I switched to channel 4 and I started talking. This is what it sounds like to navigate someone through an active avalanche debris field on a radio channel while you're watching the residual loading indicators on a seismic sensor and running probability updates in real time. It sounds like math delivered in a voice that cannot afford to carry the weight of what's underneath it. Eastern margin clear to the first debris mound. The beacon signal is strengthening. You're on the right track. Secondary crown is stable as of 90 seconds ago. Temperature holding. Soren's breathing in the radio. The crunch of his skis on debris. Signal getting stronger. Depth reading. I've got a shallow burial, maybe 80 centimeters. Moving to probe position. Copy. You have 52 minutes. I know how time works, Reid. It was the first time he'd used my name on a channel. I filed that away somewhere and kept talking. The probe strike came 4 minutes later. The burial was 70 centimeters, shallower than the beacon depth read. Because the skier had been partially ejected at the debris mound and was lying at an angle, Soren had him located in 11 minutes from first probe. He had him uncovered in 19. Casualty is conscious, Soren said, and something in the flatness of his voice shifted. Not much, just the particular quality of flatness that means relief being professionally managed. Responsive, confused, left leg injury, possible head trauma. I need to move him. What's my secondary window? I looked at the seismic data. The temperature had stopped dropping. A microinversion, probably temporary, but it had bought time. Extended. You have 90 minutes minimum. Move when you're ready. Copy. A pause. Good data, Reid. I put the radio down for exactly 3 seconds and looked at the North Bowl from the East Ridge instrument station, at the debris field and the crown face and the track Soren had taken through it, and I thought about probability windows and residual loads and the specific, enormous difference between a model and the person moving through the terrain the model described. Then, I picked the radio back up. The patrol debrief was at 1600. The skier. His name was Marcus Webb, 24, from Boulder, had a fractured tibia and a moderate concussion, and was in the Summit County Trauma Center, being very lucky to be there. The closure rope he'd ducked was photographed, documented, and the incident report was filed with the precision that all near misses deserved. After the debrief, the patrol team dispersed. Soren stayed to restock his pack, systematic, unhurried, the same post-incident inventory discipline I'd seen in Theo Reyes, and recognized now as a quality of people who had been in enough situations to understand that the next one started the moment this one ended. I sat across the table from him. My field notebook was open. I wasn't writing in it. The eastern margin call, I said. Was I right? He looked up. The crust was more consolidated there. Yes, the secondary window was accurate to within 8 minutes. He said it without flattery, just measurement. I came out with 6 to spare. I had it at 9. The temperature inversion gave you more buffer than the initial model showed. He set down the item he was restocking. You updated the window mid-operation. The data changed. You updated it in real time, on a live radio channel, while tracking the seismic sensor and running probability updates. He looked at me steadily. That's not standard forecaster protocol. No, I said. It's what the situation needed. A silence. Outside Patrol Hut 9, the mountain was doing what mountains did in the late afternoon after a significant event. Settling, redistributing, becoming something slightly different than it had been that morning. The light was dropping fast. The February dusk coming early. the temperature already falling back down toward the number I'd predicted at 600. Why did you come to A-Basin? Soren said. Specifically, it was a personal question. We both knew it was a personal question. The snowpack here is technically interesting, I said. The rain crust events. The aspect variability. It's a good research environment. That's why KIC sent you here. Yes. That's not what I asked. I looked at him. He was watching me with the open, direct attention he brought to terrain assessment. No inference, no assumption, just looking at what was actually there. I had a miss 2 seasons ago, I said. Summit County, I called a terrain open that I should have closed. Nobody was hurt. We got lucky. But I spent 8 months rebuilding my methodology from the pit observations up. I looked at my notebook. A-Basin's snowpack is where I can test whether I rebuilt it right. Soren was quiet for a moment. The probability language you use, he said. The confidence intervals. That's not how most forecasters present. It's more honest. It's more useful, he said. For patrol. For me. He picked up his pack. Most forecasters give me a binary, open or closed. You give me a decision surface. A decision surface. That's what it is. He stood, pack on his shoulders, and he was looking at me with the same expression he'd had in the doorway 11 days ago. Not the 4 seconds of silence, but what was underneath it, the real attention. Come to the hut tonight. There's a debrief the formal one missed. What debrief? The one where I tell you what the terrain looked like from inside the debris field. He said it simply. Your model is good. It would be better with that data. I closed my notebook. What time? 1900. I make decent chili. Patrol Hut 9 at 1900 in February was warm in the specific, earned way of spaces that have held a lot of cold out for a long time. The wood stove working steadily, the smell of coffee and lanolin, and the specific mountain work smell that didn't have a name but was identifiable anywhere. Soren's chili was, in fact, better than decent. He'd made cornbread too, which he presented without comment. The way he did everything that was more than it needed to be. We debriefed for an hour. It was the most useful hour of data collection I'd had all season. He described the debris field from inside it, the consolidation patterns, the way the mound had ejected the casualty, the specific texture of the crown face margin, where my eastern root call had proven correct. He had observations that no instrument could collect, the kind that lived in the body knowledge of someone who had moved through this terrain hundreds of times. I took 4 pages of notes. He watched me take them with an expression that suggested he found this. Someone writing down what he said with genuine intent to use it, either novel or satisfying or both. This is going in the seasonal report, he said, and the methodology paper I'm writing. I looked up. If you're willing to be cited. As what? Field observer. Your burial location accuracy was better than the beacon depth reading by 12 centimeters. That's a methodological note about debris field ejection patterns that matters. He looked at me for a moment. You're writing a methodology paper at a ski resort. I'm writing a methodology paper using data from a ski resort, I said. There's a distinction. The corner of his mouth. The same thing I'd seen at slide 12, small and real. Noted, he said. We ate the second bowl of chili. Outside, the temperature had dropped to the number I'd predicted, which was either satisfying or slightly grim depending on how you thought about it. The stove worked. The mountain was quiet, the way mountains were quiet after they'd done something. Not empty, just finished with that particular sentence. The miss, Soren said after a while. Summit County. I looked at my coffee. Yeah, what did you get wrong? I overweighted the surface observation and underweighted the buried layer. I saw what was on top and made assumptions about what was underneath. I turned the mug in my hands. I stopped reading and started confirming. He was quiet for a moment. I had a miss in year 3, he said. Beacon search. I was running on the strongest signal, and I missed a secondary burial. Weaker signal. Lower depth. and I didn't probe the secondary zone before I started digging. He looked at the stove. He survived. 6 minutes of burial. But 6 minutes is a long time, I said. A very long time. He looked back at me. I rebuilt my search protocol from the first probe strike. Same thing you did. I understood that. I understood it in the specific way you understood something that lived in your chest rather than your head. The weight of a miss you'd earned back, slowly, through the work of being more careful than you'd been before. Does it stay with you? I said. Yes, he said, directly, without softening it. But it's useful. The ones that stay with you are the ones that made you better. I thought about that, about the difference between a weight you carried and a weight you used. This is the other thing about being at altitude with someone who is genuinely competent. When they're honest, it lands differently. There's no buffer. The air up here is too thin for anything that isn't real. I think that's right, I said. It's not comfortable? No, I agreed. But it's true. He looked at me across the table in Patrol Hut 9, the stove between us and the mountain outside, and the season half finished. And there was something in the quality of his attention that had shifted. Not a new thing, I thought, but an old thing acknowledged, like a layer he'd been tracking for a while. Reid, he said. Yeah. Stay and finish the coffee. It was simple. It was quiet. It was not a question. Yeah, I said. Okay. March in the Colorado high country is the best and worst month. The snowpack deepest, the avalanche hazard highest, the days longest, the light most extraordinary. The mountain showed itself differently in March, the low sun cutting across the terrain at angles that revealed every subtle roll and wind feature that the flatter winter light had hidden. I read it differently in March, too. It wasn't that my methodology had changed. It was that I had a field observer now. Someone who brought observations I couldn't instrument, who read the terrain from inside it while I read it from above. The seasonal report I was writing had a section on collaborative forecasting methodology that was going to be the most interesting thing I'd produced in 4 years, and it was entirely because of a ski patrol medic who asked what my confidence interval was on day 11 and had been asking useful questions ever since. He also, on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, made dinner in Patrol Hut 9. This was not announced. It was simply a pattern that established itself. I would finish my evening data run, walk down from the instrument station in the last of the light, and there would be something on the stove. The first time I arrived to find it, I stood in the doorway for a moment, and Soren looked up from whatever he was reading and said, "Pasta tonight. Sit down." And that was that. We talked about the mountain, usually, sometimes about other mountains. He'd patrolled in Wyoming and Montana before A-Basin and had the comparative terrain knowledge of someone who'd spent a decade reading different snowpacks, sometimes about the research, my methodology paper expanding to include observations that were making it significantly better than I'd planned. Once briefly, about Denver. He had an apartment in Capitol Hill, went down on his off days, had strong opinions about which coffee on Colfax was worth the drive up. The drive up from Denver in February, I said, in the dark, in whatever this morning was weather-wise. A basin in a loading event is more interesting than Denver in a loading event, he said. There's more at stake. That's one way to put it. It's the accurate way. He looked at me across the table, the mountain dark outside, the stove warm, the week's snowpack data on my laptop between us. You drove up from Denver too, KAIC deployment. You requested this deployment, he said. I checked. I looked at him. You checked. I read the documentation for any significant snowpack event I'm going to be working. His voice was even. You requested A-Basin specifically. I wanted to understand why. I told you why. The rain crust events. You told me part of why. He closed his book. The other part is in the methodology paper, the section on collaborative observation. He paused. You knew what you were missing before you came here. You came here to find it. The fire worked steadily. Outside, the temperature was dropping exactly as my model predicted, and the snowpack was doing the slow, tectonic work it always did at night, redistributing stress, settling into itself, becoming tomorrow's problem or tomorrow's safe skiing. That's a generous reading, I said. It's a precise reading. He looked at me steadily, the particular quality of attention. He gave things that required it. I'm good at those. I thought about day 11, about the doorway, about 4 seconds of silence. That was actually a man deciding whether the counter-argument was worth making to someone he'd just met, and deciding it was, and being right. Yeah, I said, you are. He reached across the table, unhurried, certain, the same economy of motion he brought to everything, and his hand settled over mine on the laptop keyboard, warm and still. Neither of us moved for a moment. You okay? He said, quiet, the thin air honesty of it. Yeah, I said. I keep being. Something in his face, the careful stillness, briefly, opening. Me too. His thumb moved once across my knuckles. The stove worked. The mountain held its snow. The seasonal report was submitted to KIAEC on April 3rd. The methodology paper, collaborative, forecasting in high-consequence avalanche terrain, a field observer integration model, was submitted to the journal in June, with Soren Holt listed as co-author, field observer, and the source of every observation that had made the burial ejection section worth reading. The editor's response said the field data was the strongest component of the paper. I forwarded it to Soren. He replied, good data produces good results. Obviously, I laughed at my desk in the Denver CAIC office, alone, like a person who had completely lost their professional composure and found that I did not mind this at all. The A-Basin deployment ended April 15th. On April 16th, Soren drove down from the mountain to Denver in the specific way of a man who had planned to be somewhere and was not pretending otherwise. We met at the coffee place on Colfax he'd mentioned, the one worth the drive, and sat at a window table while Denver did its spring thing outside, the mountains visible to the west, still white, still enormous, still conducting their slow and patient business. Next season, he said, CAC is deploying you where? I haven't filed a preference yet. He wrapped his hands around his coffee. A-Basin's snowpack is still technically interesting. It is, I said. The rain crust events will likely recur. The aspect variability isn't going anywhere. No, I agreed. It isn't. He looked at me across the table. The careful attention, the direct honesty of it. File the preference, Reid. I looked at him, at the man who had walked into an active debris field with 6 minutes of window and come out with 6 to spare, who had rebuilt his search protocol from the first probe strike, who made cornbread without announcing it, and asked what my confidence interval was, and wrote down the restaurant he mentioned once in conversation. Already planning on it, I said. His hand found mine across the table, easy and certain. Outside, the mountains were doing what mountains did. Enormous, patient, full of everything they'd kept and everything they'd let go. I knew those mountains. I'd been reading them for 4 years, learning the grammar of what they held and what they were about to say. Soren Holt was the best field observer I'd ever worked with. He was also, I had come to understand, the most accurate reading I'd ever taken of anything. You okay? I said. He looked up, the real smile, the full one, unhurried, worth every careful thing that had preceded it. Yeah, he said. I keep being. Me too. The following February, Patrol Hut 9 had a new laminated card zip-tied to the emergency protocol board. It wasn't official. Nobody knew who put it there. It was small, the size of an index card. And it said, in precise small handwriting, Northridge access, confidence interval, certain. I left it there.